Welcome to podcast 22. It's entitled Deepening Your Discussions, and this is part one of a two-part podcast.
Quiet on the set. Lights. Camera. Action. Roll camera.
We go into detail about courageous conversations, using Nehemiah's conversation with the king when he was asking to return to Jerusalem. It's an awesome example. Yes. You can read that for yourself. What we want to do on the podcast is give you a peek into how this works with marriage, specifically how courageous conversations play into our marriage. Now, again, to define a courageous conversation, we do this in the book, but to say it here, it's those conversations that are a little risky, a little challenging. Yes. They're probably not the most favorite thing to do in the world, but they're very, very necessary for deepening intimacy in a relationship.
Right. We have a couple of mentors, and they're Dale and Colleen from California. It's Penny's prayer partner. They confronted us when we first were getting remarried.
It's all their fault.
Yeah, it's all their fault. They said, okay, Clint and Penny, what are you going to do? How are you going to affair-proof your marriage? And what kind of things are you going to do? And what are your agreements? And, who's your accountability partners? So anyway, we sat down, and Penny and I, this is part of the reason why we wrote the book, is we had to sit down and figure out what those things were. And one of the things were what we identified was to make sure that we don't get ourselves in a compromising position when we're by ourselves and with the opposite sex. So in other words, I had an instance at a school I was teaching at, and I was working late into after school was over, and there was a secretary that needed a ride home, and she didn't live too far from where I lived, and she asked if she could get a ride home with me. And well, that was one of the agreements that Penny and I said we wouldn't do, is be in a situation in a car with the opposite sex and nobody else in there. So what I did is I found someone to give her a ride home, and I did not ride home with her that day. And so those are kind of, they may sound silly to you, but what we have seen over marriages that are in crisis or in trouble, or they're separated or they're divorced, the first starting point was they crossed that boundary line.
Right, and because there was no ability, they didn't have the tools to talk about these kinds of things. I remember that night, Clint actually called me and said, hey, babe, just so you know, this is a situation I'm in. Pray, what should we do? How should I handle it? And, we talked about it. And again, couples are without these tools. In our first marriage, we did not have these tools. We did not talk courageously about these kinds of things. Just another example, I was put in a situation pretty recently. It came up unexpectedly. I was on a visit home. And even though it was a family member, an in-law, I was put in a situation where I was alone with a person of the opposite sex, and the same thing happened. It would have been one of our agreements, and it's family, it's an in-law, it's probably fine, but these are our agreements for our marriage, and we've talked courageously about those. So right away, I contacted Colleen, my prayer partner, let her know what was up, how I was handling it, and that I would let Clint know, and for her to ask me about it so that we could, talk about it and how it happened and all of that. So these are just examples, real life examples from our marriage. Don't gloss over this stuff. No. We glossed over it the first time around. And this is why we're having a two-part podcast, because talking courageously about these difficulties is not something that just happens easy. You've got to practice it. We could go on this one forever. We could have a whole podcast series just on our courageous conversations.
I'm sure we can, huh?
But we won't. But we could.
Yes. So anyway, we just want to say we'll see you next week in podcast 23, and it's going to be on Deepening Your Discussions Part 2. Yeah. So have a nice week. God bless.